Good afternoon, and welcome to Facebook Live with the Kansas City Star Editorial Board. I'm Derek Donovan of the Editorial Board, and I'm here today with Colleen McCain Nelson, Vice President for Opinion for the Star. And joining us is a very special guest who will be no stranger to anybody who follows Missouri politics. We'd like to welcome Jason Kander. Jason, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, weird times in America right now, weird times in Kansas City, everybody's shut in. But anybody who follows you in social media knows that you have not been sitting back and doing nothing. So I'd like to talk to you first about your role with the Veterans Community Project. Now, that's a 501c3 nonprofit that's known primarily in Kansas City for creating tiny homes for homeless vets, but you do other things as well. Talk a little bit about the project, if you would.
Yeah, no, I always appreciate the opportunity to plug Veterans Community Project. So first, I'll start with the way I got involved. I apologize for my I hope humorous Zoom background. I don't know. 5 minutes before we started, that was a target for my son's Nerf gun. I just thought this was better. Anyway, so I got involved with Veterans Community Project because, as probably most of the people watching this know, I stepped aside from public life a couple of years ago, almost 2 years ago now, to go to the VA and get help for post-traumatic stress and to go to the mental health side of the VA. And I found that process was a lot more difficult to navigate than I expected. And, look, I'm somebody with a phone full of influential contacts and a law degree and pretty high-level government experience. Should not have, it's going to be easy for anybody. It should have been for me. And it wasn't. And about 6 weeks before that, I had toured the VCP, Veterans Community Project, and was just so inspired by it. So I went to them, and I am just like thousands of veterans in Kansas City who walked through those doors and got help. And the help I got is they expedited the paperwork process for me, got me into weekly therapy. And for anybody who knows the story of Veterans Community Project, they do that. They do the outreach work, and they serve thousands of veterans in Kansas City. But in addition to that, as you mentioned, they've also pretty well eradicated veterans homelessness in the city with the village of tiny houses. So because of all that success, communities across the country have been asking them to expand and to replicate the model other places. And so after I had the opportunity to get about 6-7 months into weekly therapy and was doing much better, I started hanging around VCP. And finally, Brian Meyer, CEO and co-founder of the place, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, man, everybody seems to want us to come to their communities, but we don't know how to build a national organization. You've done it before. You want to just come here and do it again?" And so I jumped at the opportunity. So now I'm the president of Veterans Community Project, and my focus is national expansion, and it's going really well. I'll just answer the follow-up question, which is, where are you going to? We are just like a couple weeks away from breaking ground in Longmont, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. On top of that, we haven't really made this public yet, but it will be public soon. We are going to St. Louis. So there you go. I think I broke some news here a little bit. We're just in the process of finishing up closing on land there, and then we're also really close in good conversations with Milwaukee and Cincinnati and Oklahoma City. So everybody wants one, and we're just going to the places where we know we can deploy the quickest.
And are you finding that these tiny homes are transitional for these vets, that they're able to move from this into an apartment or a house afterward?
Yeah, this is the very best model for this. And look, it's when you think about it now and you look back, it seems like common sense, and it is. But when these guys, the founders, I'm not one of them, a Veterans Community Project, started this, it was revolutionary, and it was kind of, to a lot of people, a crazy idea. It was this group of combat vets who went out and they did something really novel. They asked homeless veterans why they weren't taking advantage of a lot of the other homelessness shelter options and housing options that are provided just in general to folks in the homelessness world. And what they found is that a lot of folks have issues connected to their service, like post-traumatic stress. They don't feel safe going into a group living environment. And so the founders got together and said, hey, why don't we just sort of replicate the experience these people had the last time they were stable and successful, last time they were on active duty. So they created the Village of Tiny Houses, which eliminates the group living aspect of it, provides wraparound comprehensive services, which is similar to what you have in the military. Like when you're on active duty in the military, often the building where you go to the dentist is either next to the same building as where you make sure you're getting paid. So they recreated this, created a really great case management system. And, the average stay is 262 days. Our positive transition rate is more than twice the average in this industry. It really, really works. And it's an honor to be a part of it. I mean, to be honest, like a lot of people, I volunteered to deploy thinking, if I do my job well, maybe I help some people come home safely. That's what I believe. And like most veterans, I never felt like I achieved. No matter what you do, you go over there and be John Wayne and save all sorts of people, and you're still, it turns out, not going to feel like you really got to bring people home safely. And now in this job, that's what we get to do. We get to bring people home safely all the time. And it's a dream come true for me.
Jason, I'm interested in how your mission might have changed or evolved a little bit during the pandemic. It seems like there are a lot of issues around homelessness that we aren't talking about enough in the midst of COVID-19. Clearly, you can't really socially distance in group living situations. It's really tough to stay healthy if you're homeless. What are you doing differently to kind of address that newfound sense of urgency given the backdrop of COVID-19?
Yeah, well, I mean, enormous credit to our veteran services team and our leadership. Like I mentioned, Brian before, and everybody else in our leadership. What they did is they looked at it and they realized pretty early on, hey, you can't just treat it when it comes to a pandemic. You can't just address it with the homeless veterans because they're mixed in with the entire homelessness population. And so what they did is they stepped up and they said, we're just going to be one of the organizations that helps take the lead here in terms of the entire homelessness, the entire response to the pandemic with regard to homelessness. And so that's what they did. They, along with several other organizations, Veterans Committee Project, just kind of quarterbacked the immediate response. I can't even remember the numbers now, but just thousands of meals and just did so much incredible work, set up downtown to immediately respond. Because the thing is, like, as you said, folks in the homelessness world, like, they can't socially distance. They obviously can't self-quarantine. And then what a lot of people don't know, what I've learned doing this work, is that being homeless is a full-time job. Like, if you're going to get your meals and if you're going to have somewhere to stay at night, there are certain places you have to be at certain times. And if those places and those services are turning you away if you have tested positive or if you have symptoms, then there's an enormous disincentive for people to come forward with those symptoms or to be tested. And so they had to make sure to accommodate all those folks. And they did a tremendous job. And now the real focus is going forward, what will this lead to in terms of additional homelessness? Because of the economic crisis aspect of this, we are preparing for needing to do more emergency assistance funding grants, keeping people from getting evicted, preventing homelessness going forward.
Another topic that is really on people's mind in the middle of the pandemic is getting people to the polls in November. Now, you are the founder of Let America Vote. That's a political action committee that is whose mission it is to try to expand access to voting and to get people to the polls. What are you trying to do right now to make sure that as many people are able to vote in November as possible?
Well, so Let America Vote is doing, I'm on the board now. I no longer run it, but I'll tell you, Let America Vote, if people go to letamericavote.org, there's all sorts of initiatives they can get involved with in terms of, pressuring members of Congress to make sure that there's adequate funding now, in addition also to the post office, but in general for making voting as accessible as possible during a pandemic. But in addition to that, keeping the pressure on local election authorities at the state and local level so that they will use the funds, they will make it safe and convenient to vote. And then personally, what I've been talking about a lot is, unfortunately, because of this mess, and it's not a mess like by accident, because of this sabotage of the post office, we don't know what's going to happen exactly with it. I've been telling people, look, unfortunately, if you are young and healthy, you're to be really safe about it and to make sure that there is no monkey business. Where I'm telling people, plan on going to vote on election day. And if you don't feel safe doing that, which is understandable, or if you are not in those categories of young and healthy and everything, then make sure you get your ballot in as soon as you can, because this is so upsetting and cynical. I mean, we could have a whole Facebook Live over the fact that they're doing this, but look, it's really important that, given that they are going to try all of these dirty tricks and sabotage the system, they being the Trump administration and the party in power, the Republicans, we have to make sure that we win, and not by one. Like, we, the Democrats, have to get out. And we just have to turn out like crazy so that no matter what they do, it's just not enough, because we have such a margin.
I think that one thing that this debate about mail-in voting has really highlighted is the fact that somehow this has become a partisan issue, and it seems like both parties should want everyone to be able to vote, but clearly this is cutting along partisan lines, with Republicans lining up on one side and Democrats opposing everything they're saying. I'm interested in how you think we got to that place, and how we can find some compromise where, you know, we can all agree on just kind of some basic precepts about voting.
Well, let's talk about compromise on this, because look, on other issues, I believe in compromise. I mean, on issues where there's a genuine disagreement between the elected officials that are trying to work this out, healthcare, education, taxes, whatever, you name it, compromise should happen. We should all, you know, come to the table and get some stuff done. But this is not one of those issues. The reason that this has become partisan is about power, and it is that the Republican Party over the last 2 decades has gradually, and now not so gradually, now it's a full feature of their system, has decided to make voter suppression a chief strategy. And what I mean by that is, rather than appeal to groups who they tend not to do very well with, what they've instead decided to do is to keep those groups from voting. Now, look, it's not the Republican Party exclusively that has committed voter suppression in this country in our history, but in our recent history over the last 20 years, it's pretty much exclusively the Republican Party. And so what we're seeing now is they just say, okay, they just make this stuff up, right? Like, you are more likely to get struck by lightning as an American than you are to commit voter impersonation fraud, which is the only kind of fraud that photo ID can even pretend that it prevents. But they don't care about that. And I tell you this to say, like, I'm not talking about Republicans, like, you know, my neighbors who are Republicans. When you talk to the average Republican voter, they say what you just said, Colleen. They say, look, I think my party is right about stuff. And I think that, you know, we make a good argument. Sorry, Siri thought I was talking to her, so I'm turning that off. But they say, look, I think we make a good argument. So we think everybody should vote, and we'll just settle it that way. But Republican elected officials are trying to hang on to power. And so that's why they perpetrate voter suppression. The post office, look, here's what this is. You know, like in a movie when there's a chase scene, and eventually at some point, like, the person running, they end up going through a restaurant, and then they're in the kitchen. This is like a common thing in movies. They're in the kitchen, and as they're running through the kitchen, they're pulling down every pot and pan behind them and like sliding drink carts behind them because they're trying to slow down the people chasing them. That's the Trump administration right now. They're losing this campaign. So what they're trying to do is just throw everything they can into the path of voters to sabotage this election. They're doing it through the post office. They're doing it through, like, claiming that mail-in voting is fraudulent, which is ridiculous. As a sidebar, 2 predecessors before me as Secretary of State, Matt Blunt, he wrote a report once that said that if you want to cut down on the possibility of fraud, you should have more advanced voting because it means there's less confusion on election day. He was right, by the way. I'm sure he's changed his view, but he was right. And so that's what they're doing. They're just trying to throw everything they can into the path of democracy as it's chasing them down for being horrible at their job. And I think what's really sad about it is it's pretty clear here that the strategy is this, is to have their people vote on election day as much as possible, cast doubt on the mail-in process, and make the mail-in process difficult. And then on election night, no matter what the returns say on election night, they'll be very incomplete. What he'll do is he'll declare victory. And then the days that follow, which will be election week, election month, with every day that he loses either his lead or he's trailing by more, he will declare those votes to be unconstitutional and try and create a crisis, or illegitimate, and try to create a crisis.
So what do Democrats do to fight that? What is the game plan?
So, unfortunately, right now, Democrats control 1/2 of 1/3 of the federal government. So what we have to do in order to fight it is we have to focus on what we can control. The House is probably going to end up going back into session to address this. That does seem to be putting some pressure on this fellow DeJoy. As my buddy Jason Kander said the other day, I haven't known this many people in an administration since the second season of The West Wing. I hate the fact that that we all know who the Postmaster General is. We shouldn't have to know who the Postmaster General is, but we do. And this fellow seems to be caving to some pressure. And he's like, yes, you caught me. I'll stop doing it from now on. But he's already done a lot of damage. And so that's good. They got to keep that pressure on those elected officials in the party. The rest of us, normal folks who are activists and volunteers, we've got to make sure that every single person we know votes and that they vote Democratic. I mean, look, another buddy of mine, Don Calloway, always likes to say that the couch is always on the ballot. So you got friends, people watching this, you got friends who agree with you on politics, but the couch is always on the ballot. And if the Republican Party is telling them every single day that this is going to be a real hassle and voting is going to be really hard, because that's the other message they're trying to get across with all this craziness, we got to make sure that nobody skips this election. And that's what we can all do.
Well, in Missouri in particular, voting early or voting absentee has never been easy. Even in a pandemic, it has not gotten much easier. You still have to get your ballot notarized, which requires you to leave the house. And so there's a lot of discussion in Missouri, not a lot of action in terms of changing that. Going forward, what do you think voting should look like in Missouri, and how do you make that happen?
Well, voting in every state should look a lot like it does in Oregon. Oregon is the gold standard. In Oregon, everybody, they don't even vote by mail. They have drop-off centers. I think there's polling places still available for folks who want to do it on election day. But I talked to somebody who's my age yesterday in Oregon, who like exactly my age, who said that they've never actually been to a polling place. Every election, they've done it, advanced voting, vote by mail. Oregon, by the way, tends to have the highest voter security and the highest turnout in the entire country. They've got automatic registration. And you know what? I'm going to simplify this. We live in a day and age where I can get on my phone and I can tell it exactly which toy I want to order for my son. It can take me like 2 minutes. I can find it. I can swipe and it'll run my credit card and it'll show up maybe tomorrow morning. But I got to maybe go stand in line to vote for like hours. That's stupid. And it doesn't have to be that way. And there's a difference between having the Republican Secretary of State, the Chris Kobach style approach to running elections, which is every voter is a criminal suspect, and the Democratic approach, which is really just a nonpartisan approach, which is these people are customers. Let's treat them like customers. Let's have a customer service attitude. And I think, and that's very doable. And by the way, this is one of the few times where everybody interacts with the government, paying your taxes, a couple other things. Why would we not want to make it an experience that's not a huge hassle?
I'm curious about how Missouri got the reputation that it has right now as being this deep red state to the bone, because it wasn't all that long ago when you had Mel Carnahan in the governor's mansion and you didn't have any Republicans in statewide office. A lot of the things that we talk about, access to elections, healthcare, these things that have come to be sort of termed democratic ideals are things that a lot of Republican voters want as well, right?
Yeah. Look, I think the way that we got here is, and it's not permanent. We don't know what's going to happen in the next election, in a few weeks. Look at things like, there's so much stuff changes so fast in this country and in this state. But a big part of it is demographics. If you look at the demographics of the country and the way they've shifted over the past decade or so, and then it used to be that you could lay like a map of the United States over Missouri, and they would match up almost perfectly. You know, the more urban and more liberal west and east coast of the state, and then you have demographically it was very similar, which is why we were this classic bellwether. And that is not exactly the case anymore. As the Latino population, for instance, has gone up across the country, it hasn't gone up in a corresponding way in Missouri. So there's a lot of issues like that. But yeah, you're right. When you look at the issues in particular, when you look at things like minimum wage, look at right to work, the vote that we had a couple of years ago. I mean, overwhelming medical marijuana. I mean, the state is on the issues a lot more progressive than people realize. And by the way, I still believe that if every eligible voter in Missouri voted, I think Democrats would probably win most of the elections. And so that's where we got to get to as a party.
I think we saw that the state was more progressive on the issues on Medicaid expansion, which just passed in Missouri, but also really highlighted, again, this urban-rural divide in the state where you basically have two different universes and they vote different ways. And I think that's becoming all the more stark in Missouri. Is there any way to kind of bridge that gap? I find it alarming that we kind of live in different worlds, whether you live in an urban area in Missouri or a rural area.
I think that one of the most important ways to bridge that, I'll give you two. One that's structural and one that is more of the responsibility of elected officials in the state. The first, the structural, is folks we gotta actually give this redistricting plan that was passed by the voters a couple of years ago in Missouri a chance, which means we got to vote down this horribly cynical and gross attempt, which I refer to as dirty Missouri, that the legislature has put on the ballot to try to trick voters into undoing this system. But if we can do that, we're going to drive a lot more compromise and a lot more collective, a lot more aligning of interests in our state legislature. And that's going to help, with that urban-rural divide. And the other is just, we have a lot of elected officials right now who one of the biggest misconceptions, I'll say it this way, one of the biggest misconceptions I had when I went to the state legislature was that partisan politics was about Democrats and Republicans fighting each other. And one of the things I found really quickly was that actually it's usually Democrats fighting Democrats and Republicans fighting Republicans, because they've all decided that they're only going to run in these primaries in these areas that they're just going to get all the way right or all the way left, and they're not going to deal with each other. And when that happens, people don't get to know each other. And I remember when Bruce Franks, who's now a former legislator, when he started, this is a guy who's a battle rapper from St. Louis, who is an amazing guy, but I'm sure most of these rural Republicans never thought they would have a relationship with Bruce Franks. And they started, at his invitation, going to St. Louis, to his district. And I think it was changing some of their minds. But you got to have the structural incentive behind that for them to follow through.
Do you think there's a path back for people to get out of their silos? The role of the media is something that we're, of course, acutely interested in. And it seems every day there are more people who only get news that they already agree with. Can we get back from that?
Yeah. I have maybe a minority view on this. It's very popular to blame the media for this. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of media outlets that I'm irritated and find them to be very irresponsible with their platform. But that said, I think that's a reflection of our democracy and the state of our democracy, not necessarily an actor upon it. And what I mean by that is when we have this crazy system of drawing districts in most places in the country that is for politicians, not for voters. When we have a primary system that rewards everybody to be, as contentious with the other side as they possibly can. And I'm not talking about being more moderate. I'm talking about just, you could be super liberal or super conservative and still run on being bipartisan and getting stuff done. And we've disincentivized that now. And then on top of that, voter suppression and an insane campaign finance system that turns every elected official into a telemarketer. If we fix those things, we are going to end up with a media that reflects that, because I think our partisan media tends to be a reflection of the partisan environment that's created by the structure of our democracy. And look, House Resolution 1 in the last Congress is one that's been pushed by Let America Vote and by the organization we've recently merged with, which is called End Citizens United. If they pass that, that's going to make a big difference. And it's the beginning of democracy reform, really a democracy reboot in this country. And that's going to be a good start, combined with, look, at some point we're going to need to massively expand national service in this country because we have a cultural problem. And that cultural problem is Americans don't know each other anymore. What do we all have as a common identity? We have a strong view on Taylor Swift, and 1 in 3 of us watched the Super Bowl. So, like, that's not a national identity, and we have to get to know each other again. And I think the surest way to do that is to have more people serving. Like in Kansas City, we need more people from west of Troost doing service work in their formative years east of Troost. If we have that as a national type program, I think it would make a difference in our culture, and that would be reflected in our politics.
Well, we are about at the end of our time. I don't want to get into anything that's too controversial, but you're the one who started it. Hot sauce on cottage cheese, Jason? Really?
It's don't knock it till you try it. I mean, it's
all right.
I live to just have people come after me for my food takes on social media.
All right. Hey, you've got a podcast. Tell people where they can find that.
Well, first of all, thank you for asking about it. Yeah, I recently relaunched Majority 54, and wherever you get your podcasts, you can get it. New episodes drop on Thursday mornings. The mission of the show, it's called Majority 54 because it's the 54% of us who did not vote for Trump in 2016. I feel we have a responsibility to communicate with the people in our lives and not just rely on TV ads and yard signs and stuff like that, but we can use the relationships we have with people who may have voted the other way in 16 or maybe thinking about voting the other way in 20. And what we do is we arm people with the tools and strategies to have those conversations without losing those relationships. So new episodes drop on Thursday morning. Last week, our guest co-host was Jason Sudeikis. This week, it's Mike Schur, who created Parks and Rec and The Good Place and all that kind of stuff. So it's a great show, I think, personally.
Super. Well, hey, Jason Kander, thanks so much for joining us with the Kansas City Star Editorial Board. We really appreciate your time. And we wish you and the Veterans Community Project good luck. And thanks to everybody who was watching along with us today. And we'll be back next week with a new show.